Thank you, Gloria. And thank you for having me back. So tonight we're going to talk about Milton Avery's Vermont. I don't read from notes. I don't read a script. I try to be as informal and open as possible. Informal while being informative. What I like to do is get a little sense of my audience before I dive in so that I can not give you too much information that you might already know or not enough of something that you do. Who here knew of Milton Avery before hearing about this talk? Okay, we've got a fairly well-informed audience. How many people have made it down to the exhibition? Okay, a few people. Excellent. So the exhibition opened at the beginning of July and it runs through November 6th. And I will say this, I'm an art historian and curator, so I'll probably say this about every work of art and every artist that I ever talk about, but there's nothing like standing in front of the actual work of art. The painting that's on the screen called Blue Trees, it's beautiful on the screen, but it's far more beautiful in person. Milton Avery is, without question, one of the greatest colorists of the 20th century. Mark Rothko, who's probably a name most of you have heard of, gave his eulogy and was in agreement, and he might be the other one that people would call the greatest colorist of the 20th century. And as hard as we try to get the colors correct when we photograph these things and reproduce them in catalogs, it's essentially impossible. And so this is a pretty good representation of this painting, but there are certain subtleties. Particularly, I've noticed when you stand in front of this painting, the particularly large light blue tree on the right almost glows in person. And it's essentially, like I said, impossible to see in person. But so Milton Avery was an American artist that by about 1960, certainly not a household name, but certainly one of the more important living American painters of the period. But he had a long and slow development, both as an artist and professionally. He grew up and lived in the Hartford, Connecticut area. Born in 1885. In fact, he hid his actual birth date for much of his life because he married Sally Michael, and her parents didn't really approve of him to begin with because he wasn't a good Jewish boy, and he was much older than Sally, and so they nipped about 8 years off of his life. In fact, many of the publications on Milton Avery during his life, while he was quite famous, say that he was born in 1893, but in fact he was born in 1885. He didn't go to the big art schools in New York City. He didn't travel to Europe to study painting. He essentially came from a blue-collar family. A lot of the older men in the family died fairly young, and he was there to help support his sisters, nieces, nephews, his mother. But he was basically from a blue-collar family that worked in factories in and around the Hartford area. And in fact, his kind of entree into fine art was a lettering course that he thought would be a professional skill that he could use. And his teacher actually said, this class is probably going to be canceled, but you need to come back and start studying painting because you certainly have an innate skill. And that was in the early 19-teens. He met Sally Michael in 1924. One of the essential elements of Avery's life and career was that once he got going by the 1920s, he summered every single summer somewhere in rural New England, Mexico, Canada. But between the summer of 1935 and 1943, he spent 6 extended summers in southwestern Vermont, in the West River Valley, in Jamaica and Rawsonville. And that's what this exhibition is drawn on. And so, as I said, he met Sally Michael in Gloucester, one of the places that he summered fairly regularly, Gloucester and Provincetown later in his life. And during the decade between 1925, when he and Sally moved to New York City, and he started coming to Vermont, he started to develop his professional career and resume in New York City. Started showing his work publicly in the mid-1920s and began to show it more and more frequently in the 1930s. The first museum to acquire one of his paintings was the Phillips Collection in 1929, shortly after he started exhibiting in New York City. And he met lifelong friends like Mark Rothko and Gottlieb. And that might come as a surprise to people who are familiar, because Mark Rothko and Adolph Gottlieb were completely non-representational abstract painters, or at least the work that we're familiar with. But when they were close friends with Avery in the early 1930s through the 1940s, while they were developing their own personal style, they were representational painters. And in fact, they spent so much time in Avery's studio that in a kind of amicable, friendly way, Avery said, "Your work's starting to look a little bit too much like mine. You need to stay away from my studio for a while." And as I've already mentioned, Rothko ended up giving the eulogy at Avery, so they remained lifelong friends. But by the mid-1930s, he was developing a reputation, but he certainly wasn't a household name by any means. And one of the things that I think is really important about the exhibition and the work here is that it's really the decade leading up to his real breakthrough. And so you see an artist who you think you may be familiar with, but most of the work that we're going to see tonight and that's down in the exhibition is stuff that I have taken largely from the Milton and Sally Avery Foundation and Avery Trust in New York City. And these are largely paintings that have been little or not exhibited at all, either during or after his life. And they give you a sense of his development and progression as an artist. And so the three themes that I really tried to focus on as I was curating this exhibition and looking at this work was, A, what was his, how did Vermont affect Avery? How did place kind of, how did he respond to place? Two, his stylistic development. How does this work fit into the larger kind of development of his career as a painter? And B, or C, we're going to look at process. We're going to look at a number of things where we see sketches, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that process went, sketch to a work on paper, such as a watercolor, to an oil. And by looking at process, I think we get a better understanding of who he was as an artist. But here we see a photograph of the Avery family, Sally Michael Avery on the left, Milton in the back, and their daughter March, who would have been about 3 or 4 years old in this, the first summer that they spent in Vermont. Milton Avery kind of famously quipped that, why talk when you can paint? And when I started working on this exhibition, I quickly found out what he meant by that. He left very, very little written or verbal records. Sally was very good at giving interviews later in her life. She lived to be 100 and was a champion for Milton's work throughout her life. She was actually the breadwinner during their lives. She was also a professional artist. She was an illustrator, commercial illustrator. And basically, she was the one who supported the family and helped take care of the business, while Milton just painted from morning till night, essentially. And again, we can get a little bit more into that. But I think this photograph, one of the few kind of things that isn't a work of art that I had to work with and kind of helping get a sense of what their time in Vermont was like, gives us a fairly good sense of the sort of kind of summer, relaxed, laid-back atmosphere that kind of pervaded their summers in Vermont. And he referred to, in one work, which we'll take a look at, a dry point, he referred to his times in Vermont as his summer holidays. I think that's a little bit of a misnomer. We have works that were made in Vermont during the spring season, and we have works that were made in Vermont during the fall. He really spent upwards of 3 or 4 months. They rented a place. During the Depression, people would rent out their rooms for cheap here in Vermont. Dorothy Canfield Fisher actually wrote a wonderful play called Tourists Accommodated, talking about how locals would rent out their rooms. And the only person that she didn't really kind of undercut in terms of their personality was the artist. The artist came through, and the family, and clearly Dorothy Canfield Fisher had great respect for her. And so, you know, places would open up their doors to people like Milton Avery, and he didn't have money. They weren't well off. March tells wonderful stories about how they would eat Spam, and they picked wild blueberries and traded them for fresh eggs and bacon in order to have food to get by. I mean, they really were scraping by to get by, and actually some of the art shows evidence of that as well. But keep this photograph in mind as we move on. The picture in the upper left is called The Picnic, Vermont from 1940. And that's Avery there in the lower left with a sketch pad in hand. He always had a sketch pad in hand. His daughter March recalls, and he actually also recorded this, actually it was probably Sally who gave the interview, said when he was in the country, he would wake up at 6 in the morning, make a watercolor before breakfast, eat breakfast, go out, swim, hike, sketching all the time, come back, make 3 or 4 more watercolors. And during the course of my work on this exhibition, I saw probably 300 or more watercolors that he executed during his time in Vermont, and I certainly didn't see all of them. He was incredibly, incredibly prolific. But that kind of sense of laid back, everyday, kind of insouciant, kind of just relaxation, the everyday. It's not a glorified history painting, it's not a religious painting, it's not an allegory, it's his everyday life. And Avery depended on this sort of situation for his subject matter throughout his career. He never invented subject matter. He was always gleaning his paintings and his subject matter from something that he had seen with his eyes. That doesn't mean that it's a photograph of what he saw. And again, we can get into that kind of process and style as we move on. But I think it's important to understand. And so how did Avery get to Vermont? Jamaica and Rawsonville are out of the way even for those of us who live here in southern Vermont. And probably the best explanation is the earliest dated painting that we have by Avery from Vermont is dated 1933. And that's the same year that Meyer Shapiro, who was a world-renowned art historian and critic, bought a summer home in Rawsonville, which is right next door to Jamaica. And during this time in the late 30s and early 40s, Shapiro was writing and thinking a lot about early French modernism, the likes of Courbet and Manet. And when you look at Avery's Picnic, as an art historian, Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe automatically comes to mind. It's kind of the iconic early French modernist painting from 1863. And when it previewed at the Salon in 1863, it was one of the inspirations behind the publication of Charles Baudelaire's essay, The Painter of Modern Life. And I have no doubt that Avery and Shapiro were sitting around in Vermont during the summer talking about things like Manet, Baudelaire. And Baudelaire wrote about, well, the line Lux calme volupté, which Matisse titled the painting after. But it's this kind of idea of laid back, again, as I've already described, but also the idea that you're not painting the grand historical subject, but you're painting everyday life, because it's in the everyday life. It's in the moments that pass us by, like a picnic with the family and friends in Townsend State Park, which is where this likely was derived from, an actual event, or a dip in the swimming hole. Those are the sorts of things that everybody experiences at some time in their life. And by picturing them and creating highly sophisticated visual images from them, they kind of capture the eternal aspects of life. And I have no doubt that Avery was thinking about these things as he was selecting his subject matter and painting during his summers here in southern Vermont. This is one of his early oils called Vermont Fall. His titles tend to be rather unpoetic. They're just descriptive. But this is from 1935, based on the first summer he had. The little bit that has been published on Avery's time in Vermont up to now, the main anecdote was that after he arrived in Vermont, it rained for the first 3 weeks, and he almost gave up. And then after it stopped raining, the sun came out and everything turned green. And if you're a painter, you know, it's really hard to create an interesting composition when all you have to work with is green. And Avery is really known more than anything else probably, for his use of non-associative color, or non-literal, non-descriptive color. And it was really during the decade that he was painting in Vermont that this started to become really to the foreground. Prior to his time in Vermont, he painted fairly naturalistic, kind of earth tone paintings, but you can see him starting to push the limits. Being that it's fall, he gets red trees to work with, so you don't have to go too far away from naturalism. But that wonderful swath of pink in the sky, yes, Vermont sunsets can be beautiful, but he's really starting to play with color and pushing the boundaries. And I mentioned before, they weren't well off, and he really scrapped by with materials. And again, it's difficult to see on the slide, but you see how there's some green in the upper left? In the sky. Why would there be green in the sky? Or even blue in the two corners. He probably took this canvas, like quite a few of the other early Vermont canvases, and scraped down earlier compositions because he didn't have a ton of money to buy new canvases. And Avery, as he developed as an artist and went into the 40s, 50s, 60s, his application of paint became thinner and thinner. So people are used to seeing really kind of beautifully thinly applied paint, and it's pretty thickly applied here. Actually, the texture in the red tree is actually scraped into the still wet paint with the pointy end of the brush. I mean, he's physically manipulating the paint. But again, it's his use of space, the way in which he's placing the trees, and really playing with color and pushing out those lines. That balance between abstraction and the real world is something that I think really sets Avery apart as an artist. This is another one of his early works from Vermont. As I mentioned earlier, and again I'll get into this more and more as we look at more images, he never painted a watercolor or an oil from life. He wouldn't have been sitting in front of the motif when he painted this painting. This would have been taken from a sketch that he did from life, a small, seemingly inconsequential sketch, and we'll see a couple of images of those. But what I love about this is titled Vermont Rain, and this is from that first summer where he almost gave up. But you know, I kind of see him almost kind of relishing the wetness of the atmosphere. Anybody who's familiar with watercolor, the way that that mountain on the right in particular is really bleeding, he got the paper really, really wet before he started to apply the paint. And as spontaneous as this and all of the works we're going to see are, they were very carefully planned out before he got to this stage. He knew the composition before he sat down. And you know, the contrast between those trees in the lower right, where you can see a lot of the white of the paper, that's called dry brush. So it's exceedingly wet up top and exceedingly dry down below. So it looks very improvisatory, but it was very carefully worked out. And his gift was the ability to kind of maintain that sense of the kind of quick brush marks that are abstract. If you pull a single tree out of an Avery picture, it's composed of maybe 3 or 4 brush strokes that seem very, very kind of almost intuitive. And in a sense they were. He was painting watercolors constantly, and so his hand and his mind, his eye and his wrist were trained, and he didn't have to think about it too much. He had his composition set, and he said, his grandson Sean, who I worked with in organizing this exhibition, said he could have whipped out a watercolor like that in less than an hour. But as Sean said, he is also a painter, and his mother March, Milton and Sally's daughter, is also a painter and painting to this day. Sean once asked Sally, he said, "What do you think of this new painting of Sean's?" And Sally said, "It's good, Sean, paint another one." And it's this idea of continually working and working and working and not getting too attached. And through that process, I think Milton, too, got this sense of just being able to just let it go, not think too much about it. And it resulted in these beautifully fresh, loose works on paper. The watercolors were really a revelation for me. I'm an Avery fan, and I thought I knew Avery before I started working on the show, but the watercolors that he produced here on Vermont are really astonishing, both in terms of their quantity and the joy of mark making and the beauty of the colors. Here's another one. Gives you a sense of that. Again, you know, very wet on the left-hand side, yet that dark right ridge of the mountain, that's dry brushing. So the whole composition had to be carefully thought out before he actually put brush to paper, and yet he maintained this vibrant sense of the hand and the kind of intuitive mark. And of course, again, Fall allowed him to go a little crazy with the colors and push those reds and yellows. Again, just to give you a sense of the variety of the watercolors. Every work that you've seen up to this point is in the show except for the Manet. So, you know, I have 2 walls in the exhibit installed not unlike this, where you can see kind of the variety of the types of compositions he was painting. I organized an exhibition of the artist Rockwell Kent, who is essentially a contemporary of Avery's, a very different type of painter, but he lived and worked actually just south of here in Arlington for 6 years between 1919 and 1925. And he only painted about 24 oils based on his time in Vermont, and all of them, except for one, are looking south from his studio or looking north from his studio. That wasn't Avery. Avery was insatiable in searching out subject matters. He came to Jamaica, stayed for 3 months, and they were constantly hiking, driving. They had a car in their possession. They could drive around. And really his kind of, the territory in which we know that he was working stretched from Rawsonville and Bonneville all the way into, excuse me, all of a sudden I'm drawing a blank. What was that? Townsend, thank you, Townsend State Park. It's about a 20-25 mile square radius. So he wasn't just getting up in the morning and going into his backyard or taking a 5-minute walk, but he was really searching out subject matter that he could work with, from a forest interior with the sun shining through it to an open field with the trees. And again, this wonderful sense of seemingly abstract mark making, and yet in that upper right hand corner, for example, you can see the birch on the left with the blue shadows and the pine on the right. He didn't have a formula, you know, the kind of squiggly marks that you see in the fir. You know, he went for a different style with that blue spruce in the lower right. You know, he gets the specificity of what he's painting, but it's not through detail. It's through kind of distillation of the essential elements, the color, the line, the form. But it's not a photographic depiction, and yet somehow he captures the essential quality of whatever it is that he's painting. He was voracious when it came to studying the history of art. He lived in New York City from 1925 on. He went to art exhibits and museums every weekend. And then the lower left painting, I see, you know, he had an interest in Asian art, you know, Chinese literati painting. He was interested in Japanese painting. There's a dry point in the exhibition called Japanese Landscape. It's not a Japanese landscape, it's a Vermont landscape, but it has a kind of Japanesque feel to the mark making and the asymmetrical composition. He was really absorbing, you know, from 19th century French painting to ancient Chinese brush painting to 19th century Japanese woodblocks, and applying all of it to his own work, taking what he thought he could work with and using it at will. There's another just beautiful watercolor from the show, Untitled Small Farm. Early in his time in Vermont, again, as I already mentioned, he had a kind of thick palette when it came to his oil paintings, but he really started producing watercolors in such quantity. I have no doubt that the process of making a watercolor is very different from the process of making an oil painting, and I think it very much informed his development as an oil painter. You can start to see the kind of use of what I refer to as non-associative color, with the patches of pink, yellow, different shades of green, and the way in which the horizon line, if you've ever been to the West River Valley over by Jamaica, you're surrounded by hills, and so you're really forced to create a very high horizon line. And again, Avery didn't really become famous until really the late 1950s into the early 1960s, and he was being compared to the abstract artists of his day, like his friends Rothko and Gottlieb, and we'll take a look at some comparisons towards the end of the talk. But you know, that sense of the flat plane of the picture was something that abstract painters were very, very interested in. But Helen Frankenthaler, who went to Bennington College and studied with Paul Feely, who was the head of the art department there, they were all interested in this kind of ambiguous, kind of trying to play with the back and forth between the fictive reality of the space depicted and the flat plane of the picture. And Avery really starts to push that. And I think the high horizon line of Vermont might have had a real impact on how he kind of developed that kind of back and forth play between the flatness of the canvas or the sheet of paper as it may be, and the fictive space of the composition. And you can really see that coming to the fore in this painting, which dates from 1937. So it's fairly early for his Vermont works, but you can start him seeing to really push that kind of sense of flat space and arbitrary color and patterning. And yet, always it seems to hold together into a highly representative. You immediately see it and know what it is. If you've been through the West River Valley, there are, that's the road leading through. That's probably Route 30 there, driving between Jamaica and Townsend, somewhere in there. And you've seen a farm like that off on the side, surrounded by patchwork fields. This is called Thoughtful Swimmer. It's probably his daughter March at about 11 years of age. His wife Sally back there, sketch pen in hand. She was an artist too. Just a wonderful, most of his Vermont work, for understandable reasons, is landscape based. He was surrounded by the incredible landscape here in southern Vermont. And the vast majority of the work that he did, he was dependent on the landscape. But he was an incredible figure painter as well, and this is really one of the stronger figurative paintings. The way in which he would stretch March's form, she wasn't monumental like that. She was only an 11-year-old girl, and I don't think she had that bad of a sunburn. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, again, once he got down the idea, once he captured the idea in a quick sketch, he would play with color. He would play with lengthening a figure, taking out an element, and we'll see a couple of those ideas. His end goal was to create a formally sophisticated picture that held together in the end as a successful composition. There are about 5 pictures of March actually hanging all in a row in the exhibition. This is one of them. Her skin tone and her hair color is different in every one of them. And again, he's not trying to paint March. March just happened to be the person who was standing in front of him when he sketched the idea and created the composition. He wasn't worried about making sure that her hair color was right in the end, in the final picture. In fact, here's another one of March and Sally sketching behind their house. So this is an oil that he would have developed, again, out of a sketch and probably a work on paper before he ended up getting to the oil stage. A wonderful, you can start to see the lightening of the palette, the lightening of the application of paint. It's a little difficult to see in a digital image, but trust me, it's there. This kind of beautiful minimalism of how he's just scraping in their facial features, again with the sharp end of the brush or possibly a pin while the paint is still wet. This distillation to concrete forms, each figure is made up of a couple blocks of color and strong outlines that you start to see come really to the fore in the 1940s and 50s in Avery's work. So here we can talk a little bit more directly about process. So in the upper left is a sketch that he did during his first summer in Vermont in 1935. And again, as I've already said, he would create sketches constantly, and he would come back to wherever his makeshift studio was in Vermont. Again, we don't have a lot of details. He was renting places. He might have made one in a bedroom or a spare room at the house. He might have even just set up outside if the weather was good. And he would just riffle through his sketches and try to figure out what compositions were best, and then he would develop, so those sketches and then watercolors would come back with him, and he almost always would have done a watercolor before an oil. So we don't have the watercolor that resulted in this case, but that oil was painted probably the winter or spring, that winter or spring, because it's dated 1936. And you can see he's starting to kind of distill the image and hone in on the essentials. There's a figure standing behind that main rock in the sketch, which he deletes in the painting. There's a lot of kind of kind of linear detail that you see in the drawing too, which again, he distills the painting into large blocks and masses of color that kind of fit together like a puzzle. And again, these elements come together more and more as his career moves on. But interestingly, in this case, this is a composition where he came back 2-3 years later, and that was not unusual for him at all. We'll see a couple of instances where it was sometimes 5 years between a work on paper and the oil that resulted. But this dry point, so it's a print, kind of related to an engraving, where you'd have a copper plate, and then he would use a stylus, a very sharp tool, and then draw the image into the copper plate. And you can see actually the composition is reversed from the drawing to the dry point, because he's not really concerned about the reversal fact. When you draw into something and then you turn it around and print it, the image is reversed. But what's interesting is most of his sketches are actually, there are multiple ones on a single sheet of paper. Again, he's being very efficient with his materials and trying to make as much use of it as possible. At the bottom of the sheet of paper on which that sketch was drawn, he experimented with writing his name backwards. In order to, it looks like he still had a little bit of difficulty there. The R and the Y are a little off. He wasn't, he experimented with printmaking throughout his life, but he wasn't a really dedicated printmaker. So you could tell, though it's a beautiful, the way he's able to adapt his very wonderful kind of calligraphic line to the print medium, but he was having a little difficulty with his name there. But it gives you a sense of his process, how he would go from sketch to painting, and then sometimes go backwards again, back to the sketch years later, and develop a completely new composition where, again, the figure comes back in. The composition is far more lateral on the print. He just uses these works on paper as kind of the stimulus, and he keeps them in his studio. He probably, rifles through them on occasion and says, "Ooh, I haven't thought about that one for a while," brings it out and starts to rework it and turn it into a wholly new composition. There's another example of this, the gouache on black construction paper at upper left. I know that there's a watercolor. I've seen an image of a watercolor that's the exact same composition. The palette in the watercolor is completely different than the palette in the gouache. It's a much kind of blonder, in fact, a little bit more similar to this, but you can tell that he used the gouache to work up the oil. In fact, the way in which he used those hills in the background, which are just the reserved paper. He didn't have to paint the hills in the work on paper because the paper he was working on was black. And yet, I love how you can see his kind of creative process and his thought process when comparing these works together. I love this little brush stroke right here. Kind of like like the quiver of a wrist, and the way that it sits right next to this kind of area of black reserved paper. You can tell, it kind of reminds me of a little group of unruly bushes or trees, and I think Avery really liked that passage because you can see he kind of struggled to try and recreate it and kind of maintain that spontaneity. And you can go from kind of element to element and see how, he tries to adapt that kind of free, loose sense of the brush. A gouache is essentially a watercolor. It's a water-based medium, so it's very free and loose. And he was really struggling, but not struggling because he did a pretty dang good job of it, but he's always trying his best to maintain that sense of kind of spontaneity and fluidity in his oils as he adapts them from his works on paper. So here's an example that is in the exhibit where we have a sketch at the upper left, a watercolor on the bottom right, and then shortly we'll see an oil that was based on them. And these were all in separate collections, and so I've brought them together for this exhibition, again, to give people the literal ability to look from work to work. So this sketchbook is hanging right below this watercolor, and right next to them is the final oil on the exhibition. And you can really see his mind. This is from a sketchbook which is now in the collection of the National Gallery of Art, and we borrowed it for this exhibition. And there are about 3 or 4 sketches from this sketchbook that relate directly to other compositions in the exhibition as well. Unfortunately, because of the nature of a sketchbook, you can only show 1 page in the context of an exhibition. But you can see it's very quick loose, almost kind of scratchy, scribbly. You can imagine him going very quickly, kind of just dotting in ideas, and yet it's very, very specific. I like to point out this kind of cleft in the mountain. There's a big rock here, and I see there's probably a fairly large gap between this back hill and this front hill, and he's capturing that sense of space beautifully. The way in which he's captured those back atmospheric mountains just through the kind of light sketching of some parallel lines with a squiggly one on top, and he carries over most of that into the watercolor. But you can see him, again, that cleft. That sense of spatial recession didn't seem to matter to him when he adapted it into a watercolor. And you can see him taking notes. This is Ball Mountain. It says Li green leaves, light green leaves, which you see here on this kind of tall, scraggly plant here. You see blue fir right here below that. So his sketches are a way of kind of accumulating information. It's like information gathering for an artist, essentially. It's getting all of the bare facts, setting the composition, and of course color is so important to him, so he really wanted to capture the sense of color as well. So he would write these little notes to him for when he came back to a work in the studio, whether it be a day or a week or a month later. And then from that he produced this. And he came back to this 2 years after the watercolor and the sketch. So again, it's an instance in which it's not a straightforward linear process. It's not he goes out, makes a sketch one morning, come back, does a watercolor that afternoon, and then starts working on an oil painting. Even that fall or that winter when he's back in his New York studio, he never painted in oils in Vermont. All of his Vermont oils are based on the works on paper that he brought back with him. We can just bump back and forth between this. The most obvious element as he translates the watercolor to the oil is the deletion of this central tree. And we actually had a wonderful gallery talk on Friday with Karen Wilkin, who's a fabulous critic and curator who's written extensively on mid-20th century American painting and sculpture. And I was thinking, I think the green is really important in this composition, and he thought he might need more of it. But Karen pointed out that that tree and that watercolor really serves as a central axis. It's a focus point. And Avery is more and more, these are both from the mid-40s. So the watercolor and the sketch are both from 43, and this oil is from 45. He's moving closer and closer, even though he's maintaining the sense of realism that his abstract expressionist friends are in the sense of overall composition. You think of Pollock's probably the most obvious one. There's no central point of interest. The entire surface of the canvas or the sheet of paper has equal emphasis. And Karen was thinking, by taking out that central tree, there seems to be interest all over, scattered over the surface of the painting. And but again, exactly why he pulled that tree, we're never going to be able to know for sure. But he's making these decisions based on the kind of visual qualities that he wanted to convey in the end product, whether it be an overall sense of composition, he felt he needed more green, whatever it was, he would distill these images down and delete as he felt necessary. Here again is a kind of combination of images that help you see how he arrived at one of the signature paintings on the show, Blue Trees, which we borrowed from the Neuberger Museum of Art. Founded by Roy Neuberger. He was one of Avery's most important patrons. He owned over 100 Avery paintings during his life. Avery had very interesting relationships with his dealers. He was represented from the mid-30s until the late 30s by Valentine Dudensing, Valentine Gallery, one of the premier galleries in New York City of modern painting, showed Matisse and other of the French modernists. But what Avery did, and I don't know whether this was Sally's idea or Milton's idea, he would have his dealers buy out his paintings, the paintings that they wanted, at very reduced prices, and then they would give him a commission as they sold. And so when he moved from Valentine Gallery to Paul Rosenberg, who was another of the leading galleries dealing in the European modernists in 1943, Valentine was stuck with this Avery inventory that he had paid for, but he hadn't fully paid the artist because they hadn't sold yet. And so Neuberger ended up sweeping in and buying up the entire inventory. And he did the same thing again when Avery moved from Rosenberg. So Neuberger was a very important patron. But there's a wonderful anecdote about this painting. He actually apparently bought this painting directly out of Avery's studio. From the recollections that Sally gave, it sounded like he was being a bit picky as they kept pulling painting after painting. He had something critical to say about every single painting and seemed to be unhappy and wasn't settling on anything. It sounded like they were trying to tell him the basics of the painting. You know, this painting was done in based on one of our summers in Vermont. And Neuberger said, "I've never seen blue trees in Vermont." And Milton replied, "Oh, that was New Hampshire." Well, the fact is it was Vermont. And in fact, this is a real photo, detail of a real photo postcard looking from Ball Mountain, which we saw painted in the previous picture, looking south into what is now Jamaica State Park. This is where the campgrounds are. This is the bend in the river where the Salmon Hole is. We'll see some paintings of them swimming in Salmon Hole here shortly. And this is the watercolor, again, almost certainly based on a plein air sketch that he would have made from a hike. He probably hiked up into Ball Mountain, not an easy hike, I can tell you, and would have taken that sketch, developed this watercolor, not in the exhibition, but in the permanent collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And it wasn't for 5 years until he came back to this watercolor and made this oil in 1945. This watercolor dates from 1940. But you can see how he's finding a balance between kind of an objective capturing of the real world. You can see he clearly kind of emphasized this round form. Maybe his vantage point was slightly different. I don't know how much he moved this little mountain. He clearly erased this back mountain in order to emphasize the kind of contours of this forward mountain. He kind of emphasized the curve of the river. And then the palette, again, he continues to push further and further into the realms of non-associative color. You know, and he captures not just what he saw, but his emotional response to what he saw in these pictures. And you can see, you know, the basics are laid out in the work on paper, but then he really started to push for a greater sense of atmosphere, light, and space through the juxtapositions of color in the final oil painting. So the exhibition winds down by about 1945. They stopped coming and summering for extended periods in 1943. So this oil is based on, well, it's actually based on a 1940 painting, but painted in 1945. This is the last painting in the exhibition, and we're jumping all the way to 1960. This is the sort of painting that Milton Avery became famous for and is probably still famous for to this day. We borrowed this painting from the National Gallery of Art as well. And this was actually given to them by Sally for the 50th anniversary of the National Gallery of Art, and it's really the only major Avery that they own. There's an anecdote that Sally recorded about them taking a drive through southern Vermont. He often went and spent some time during the summers at Yaddo, the artist retreat over in Saratoga Springs, and apparently he wanted, during one of those summers, he wanted to go back through southern Vermont and kind of revisit some of his old haunts here in southern Vermont, and they had a roadside picnic in 1958. And the watercolor and sketch on which this painting in the lower right are still in the foundation, the Avery Foundation. But you can see 15 years, you can see how the essential sense of form, the rounded mountains, the color is all there by the end of his time in Vermont. He starts to strip away more and more what I refer to as kind of the associative mark making, which is what really makes his Vermont work astonishing. I think the variety and kind of sense of the abstract mark and the way in which you can make a million different marks convey a sense of a tree or a river or a mountain are really remarkable. But in the 15 years between 1945 and 1960, he started to strip down painting more and more to its bare essentials of these large kind of luminous areas of color. And when critics and art historians are describing paintings like this late one, they also often refer to these, you know, blocks as kind of uniform monochromatic areas of color. But one of the things that I love about having this painting at the end of this exhibition hanging essentially right next to this painting is you can see how, you know, that blue is not a flat blue. He kept that sense of mark making and brushing. It's never a simple layer of one color. Very difficult to tell in reproduction. There's at least 2, if not 3 or 4 different layers of color. When you look at that pink sky, you can see blues and lavenders peeking through at different areas. And it's this very sophisticated layering of marks and layers of color, which again, in contrast to the earlier Vermont work, you can get that sense of his mastery of the brush and the way in which you can layer colors. But it was paintings like this that really brought him fame in the late 50s. The great critic Clement Greenberg kind of out of character wrote a very long, important article on Avery in 1958 because he was really a champion of non-representational abstract painting. But one of the things that I think was important about that article is he made a very astute point that as much as Avery strips down the landscape to its bare essentials, there's always something of the specific in it. You know, this looks like the Green Mountains, like the West River Valley. It'd be probably impossible to figure out exactly where they were when he painted this picture, but he never quite left behind that sense of the specificity of place and the kind of devotion and love of depicting the subject matter so that you got an essential feel for its character. But he was more and more, late in his career, when he was painting pictures like this, compared with his colleagues. And I bring up this. This is an early Avery painting from Vermont, not in the exhibition. We actually have another painting that was almost certainly based on the same sketching session, because we have this big, large log in the background, the same swimming hole, this figure here and this figure here. But this figure right here is actually Adolph Gottlieb. The Gottliebs came up and visited with the Averys in 1937, and they sketched alongside of one another. And this, again, this relationship between Avery and the younger abstract expressionist colleagues, I think is an important one, and one in which eventually brought Avery the fame that he deserved. This is a late Avery from 1960. It's an image based on his time in Provincetown. He's looking out across the bay at dusk as the moon is rising above the lights on the horizon with the wine-dark sea. And this is a Gottlieb from about 1960. They actually had side-by-side studios in Provincetown in the late 50s and early 1960s. And while you can still see the representational sense of what he's picking, I mean, I can say that's the reflection of the sunset on the water, that's the spit with the lights across the way on the moon rising. You can see how Avery and his colleagues were coming closer and closer together near the end of his life. And it was this back and forth dialogue. It wasn't one where early in their careers Gottlieb was being influenced by Avery, and late in his career Avery was being influenced by Gottlieb. I think it was a give and take. In fact, this is an interesting comparison that I have in the essay, and I actually have this watercolor on view in one of our other galleries called Bennington Modernism, that shows the work of artists who lived and worked in the circle of Bennington College in the 1960s. This is a watercolor by Paul Feely, who was the head of the visual art department at Bennington College from just after World War II until his untimely death in 1966. And he had largely, like Gottlieb and Rothko, abandoned representational imagery by the early 1950s. But he went on sabbatical in 1961 and 62 to Greece and Spain and made this series of wonderful, beautiful watercolors that find that kind of razor-thin line between abstraction and reality, and it was without doubt influenced by Avery. He became this kind of iconic figure that everybody was looking to try and find that balance. Well, Feely and his colleagues were making non-representational painting. Avery actually had an exhibition at Bennington College in 1960. So it's not an accident that Feely made a watercolor that looks so close to Avery's work a couple of years later. He was this kind of touchstone figure during this period that everybody was looking at and learning from. And finally, just we'll leave this image while I let people ask me questions. Thank you. Excellent.